On the frozen morning of January the 2nd, 1855, the residents of Callaway County, Missouri, awoke to the acrid smell of charred wood and something far worse drifting across their farmlands. What they discovered in the smoldering ruins of the Newsom barn would become one of the most horrifying and deliberately buried cases in American legal history. Inside those blackened timbers lay the calcified remains of Robert Newsom, a respected landowner whose body had been burned so completely that only his gold pocket watch and wedding ring remained identifiable. But this wasn't an accident, and it wasn't random violence. This was the culmination of 5 years of systematic brutalization that pushed a 19-year-old enslaved woman named Celia to commit an act so shocking that Missouri's courts would spend months trying to decide whether she even had the legal right to defend herself. What happened in that barn wasn't just murder. It was a reckoning that exposed the darkest contradictions at the heart of American society. A story so disturbing that local authorities buried every record they could find. Before we continue with the story of Celia and the night that changed everything, I want you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what state you're listening from, because this story reveals truths about American history that every corner of this country needs to hear. The events I'm about to tell you were documented in court records, newspaper clippings, and witness testimonies that survived in the Missouri State Archives, though many suspected that crucial documents mysteriously disappeared in the decades that followed. Callaway County in 1850 was a prosperous farming region along the Missouri River, where tobacco and hemp plantations stretched across rolling hills dotted with modest farmhouses and imposing manor homes. The county sat squarely in the heart of what locals called Little Dixie, a stretch of central Missouri where Southern plantation culture had taken deep root, complete with the institution of slavery that fueled its economy. Nearly 40% of the county's population lived in bondage, working the fields and serving in the houses of families who'd migrated from Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, seeking cheaper land and greater opportunity. Robert Newsom was exactly the type of man who thrived in this environment. At 60 years old, he owned a substantial farm 6 miles south of the county seat of Fulton, complete with a 2-story white farmhouse, several outbuildings, and 60 acres of prime agricultural land. Neighbors respected him as a hard-working widower who'd raised 2 daughters, Virginia and Mary, after his wife's death in 1849. His farm produced enough tobacco and corn to maintain a comfortable lifestyle, and he owned 5 enslaved people who handled the bulk of the manual labor. What made Newsom different from many slaveholders wasn't his wealth. His holdings were modest by plantation standards, but his reputation for absolute control. Neighbors would later testify that his farm ran with military precision, that his enslaved workers moved with the careful efficiency of people who understood the consequences of disappointing their master. The local Methodist congregation knew him as a regular churchgoer who donated generously to missionary work, though some noted that he attended services alone, leaving his household behind on the farm. In June of 1850, Newsom made a purchase that would seal both his fate and that of a 14-year-old girl whose name would echo through Missouri's legal system for decades. At the Audrain County Courthouse, he paid $800 in gold coin for Celia, described in the bill of sale as a Negro girl of good health and breeding potential. The seller, William Grayson, had owned Celia since birth on his eastern Missouri farm, but financial difficulties forced him to liquidate his human property. Court records show that Grayson specifically marketed Celia as suitable for household work and breeding, a euphemism that carried horrifying implications in the slave markets of the antebellum South. Celia's journey from the Grayson farm to Newsom's property covered less than 50 miles, but it represented a passage into a hell that would consume the next 5 years of her life. She was a tall girl for her age, with what witnesses described as intelligent eyes and a quiet manner that suggested education beyond her station. Former enslaved people who knew her would later recall that she could read simple words and had learned basic arithmetic, skills that were not only unusual but technically illegal for enslaved people in Missouri. The Newsom farm where Celia arrived that summer was a world unto itself, isolated enough that screams wouldn't carry to neighboring properties, yet close enough to town that Robert maintained his reputation as a pillar of the community. The main house sat on a small rise, looking down on slave quarters that consisted of a single log cabin with a dirt floor and no windows. Behind the house stood the barn that would later become the scene of the most shocking crime in Callaway County history. A sturdy structure built from local timber with thick walls that muffled sound and a loft where feed was stored during winter months. From the moment Celia set foot on Newsom's land, neighbors later testified, something felt different about the farm's atmosphere. The other enslaved workers, Ben, a man in his 30s, Coffee, a woman of middle age, Patsy, Coffee's teenage daughter, and young Joe, barely 10 years old, moved with a tension that went beyond the usual wariness of enslaved people. When questioned years later during legal proceedings, several admitted that they'd been warned by Newsom to mind their own business regarding his treatment of the new girl. What none of them could have predicted was that this quiet 14-year-old would ultimately become the catalyst for a legal case that would expose the fundamental contradictions of American justice, forcing Missouri's courts to confront questions they'd spent decades avoiding. Could an enslaved woman legally defend herself against rape? Did property have the right to resist its owner? And what happened when the law's protection of white male authority collided with its pretense of Christian morality? The assault began on Celia's first night at the Newsom farm, and it would continue with methodical regularity for the next 5 years. What we know about those early months comes from testimony that Celia herself would later give. Words so devastating that the court reporter's handwriting visibly trembled as he recorded them. According to her account, Robert Newsom made his intentions clear before she'd even unpacked her few belongings in the slave cabin. He told me I was to come to the house when he called, Celia testified, her voice barely above a whisper in the packed courtroom. Said I was bought for more than field work and that I'd learn what that meant soon enough. The pattern that emerged was as calculated as it was horrifying. During the day, Newsom maintained the facade of a respectable Christian farmer, working his fields, attending to business in town, and maintaining cordial relationships with his neighbors. But after dark, when his daughters had retired to their rooms and the other enslaved workers had been warned to remain in their quarters, he would summon Celia to the main house. The physical evidence of these assaults mounted over the months and years that followed. Celia gave birth to her first child, a son, in 1852, when she was barely 16 years old. Newsom's daughters, Virginia and Mary, would later claim they knew nothing about their father's nocturnal activities, though neighbors testified that it would have been impossible to remain ignorant of a pregnancy occurring under their own roof. The child bore an unmistakable resemblance to Robert Newsom, with the same pale green eyes and prominent chin that marked the family line. More disturbing still were the methods Newsom used to ensure Celia's compliance and silence. According to testimony from other enslaved people on the farm, he kept detailed records of every person's behavior in a leather-bound ledger, noting infractions both real and imagined. This book became a tool of psychological torture, a threat that could be held over anyone who might consider interfering with his treatment of Celia. One wrong word, one gesture of sympathy, and the punishment would extend beyond Celia to include anyone who dared show her kindness. Ben, the oldest enslaved man on the farm, later testified that Newsom had explicitly warned him that what happens in this house after dark is nobody's business but mine, and anyone who makes it their business will find themselves sold downriver faster than they can say goodbye. This threat carried particular weight in Missouri, where being sold downriver meant transportation to the brutal sugar and cotton plantations of Louisiana and Mississippi, where life expectancy was measured in years rather than decades. The isolation of the Newsom farm played a crucial role in enabling these crimes. The nearest neighbor lived nearly half a mile away, too far to hear sounds from within the house or slave quarters. The farm's layout had been deliberately designed to provide privacy. The slave cabin sat behind a grove of oak trees that blocked sight lines from the main road, while the house itself was positioned to give Robert Newsom a clear view of anyone approaching his property. By 1853, Celia had given birth to a second child, this one a daughter who also bore her master's unmistakable features. The local Methodist minister, Reverend John Hammond, would later testify that he'd noticed Robert Newsom's particular satisfaction during this period, describing him as a man who seemed to take unusual pleasure in his domestic arrangements. When pressed for details, Hammond admitted that he'd found it strange that Newsom never spoke of seeking a new wife, despite being a relatively young widower, instead expressing contentment with his current household situation. What made Celia's situation even more horrific was the legal framework that enabled it. Under Missouri law, enslaved people were classified as property, with no legal standing to file complaints or seek protection from abuse. More specifically, Missouri's statutes made it impossible for an enslaved woman to legally accuse a white man of rape. The very concept was considered a legal impossibility, since property could not withdraw consent from its owner. This legal reality created a perfect storm of vulnerability that Robert Newsom exploited with increasing boldness. Neighbors would later recall seeing him escort Celia to town on several occasions, describing their relationship as that of a man showing off his finest possession. At the general store, witnesses observed him purchasing fabric for dresses that were far finer than typical slave clothing, as well as small luxuries like ribbons and soap that suggested a relationship that went beyond that of master and field hand. The psychological toll of this prolonged abuse became evident to the other enslaved people on the farm, though they were powerless to intervene. Coffey, who worked in the Newsom household, later testified that Celia often appeared withdrawn and fearful, especially when Robert's daughters were away visiting relatives. During these periods, Coffey said, the house felt like death itself had settled over it. The most disturbing aspect of Robert Newsom's behavior may have been his apparent belief that his actions were not only legal but morally justified. According to testimony from his daughters, he often spoke of his responsibilities as a slaveholder, claiming that he provided better care for his human property than many other masters in the county. This twisted logic allowed him to frame his systematic rape of Celia as a form of benevolence. He was, in his mind, providing her with shelter, food, and even luxuries that she would never have access to otherwise. But by late 1854, something fundamental began to change in Celia's demeanor. Several witnesses would later testify that she seemed to be gathering courage, speaking more directly to other enslaved people on the farm and asking pointed questions about legal matters that no enslaved person was supposed to understand. Coffey recalled one conversation in particular, where Celia asked whether a person could be held responsible for protecting themselves if the law wouldn't protect them. These questions would prove to be more than idle curiosity. As 1854 drew to a close, Celia was pregnant with her third child, and according to later testimony, she had reached a breaking point that would transform her from victim to perpetrator of one of the most shocking crimes in Missouri history. The winter of 1854 brought an unusual coldness to Callaway County, with temperatures dropping below zero for weeks at a time and snow piling so high that many farms became completely isolated from their neighbors. This harsh weather created the perfect conditions for the events that would unfold on New Year's night, providing cover for both the crime itself and the desperate attempt to conceal its aftermath. During this period, Celia's behavior underwent a transformation that didn't go unnoticed by the other people living on the Newsom farm. Ben later testified that she had begun asking strange questions about fire, how quickly different materials burned, whether buildings could collapse from heat, and what happened to bones when exposed to extreme temperatures. At the time, he assumed these questions stemmed from her responsibilities for maintaining the household fires during the bitter winter months. More ominously, Coffee reported that Celia had begun collecting small objects around the farm, pieces of rope, metal implements, and what appeared to be combustible materials like dried hay and pine pitch. When questioned about these items, Celia claimed she was preparing for emergency situations in case the family became snowed in without adequate supplies. Given the severity of the weather, this explanation seemed reasonable enough that no one pressed her for details. What we now know, based on evidence that emerged during the subsequent trial, was that Celia had spent months developing a plan that was as methodical as it was desperate. Court documents reveal that she had somehow gained access to legal texts, possibly borrowed from Newsom's own library, and had begun to understand the hopelessness of her situation under Missouri law. If she couldn't seek legal protection from her master's abuse, she would have to create her own form of justice. The catalyst for Celia's final decision came in late December when Robert Newsom announced that his daughters would be spending the New Year holiday with relatives in Jefferson City, leaving the farm under his sole supervision for nearly a week. For Celia, who was now visibly pregnant with her third child, this news carried terrifying implications. Previous experience had taught her that periods when the daughters were absent invariably meant intensified abuse, as Newsom felt free to act without even the minimal constraint of having his adult children nearby. On December 30th, 1854, Celia made what would later be described as her first direct attempt at resistance. According to her own testimony, she approached Robert Newsom and explicitly asked him to cease his nocturnal visits, citing her pregnancy and her deteriorating health. This conversation, which took place in the kitchen of the main house while Coffee worked nearby, represented a profound break with the established power dynamics of the farm. Newsom's response was swift and brutal. Coffee later testified that she heard raised voices, followed by the sound of a physical altercation. When she entered the kitchen, she found Celia on the floor with a bleeding lip and Robert Newsom standing over her, his face flushed with rage. "You don't make demands in my house," Coffee heard him say. "You'll do as you're told, when you're told, or you'll learn what real punishment looks like." That evening, as the temperature plummeted toward zero, Robert Newsom made good on his threat. According to Celia's later testimony, he summoned her to his bedroom with unprecedented violence, making it clear that her pregnancy would not protect her from his desires. The assault that followed was, by Celia's account, the most brutal she had endured in 5 years of systematic abuse. But something had changed in Celia during those winter months of planning. Rather than submitting to despair, as she had so many times before, she made a decision that would alter the course of her life and create one of the most controversial legal cases in American history. On the evening of December 31st, 1854, as Robert Newsom prepared for what he assumed would be another night of unchallenged domination, Celia was making final preparations for an act of resistance that would send shockwaves through Missouri's legal system. New Year's Eve of 1854 arrived with a bitter wind that howled through the bare trees surrounding the Newsom farm, creating an atmosphere of isolation that seemed to press down on the small collection of buildings like a physical weight. The temperature had dropped to nearly 20 degrees below zero, cold enough that the windows of the main house were covered with thick frost that obscured any view of the outside world. For Celia, who had spent weeks planning for this moment, the extreme weather provided both opportunity and cover for what she was about to attempt. During the day, Robert Newsom had followed his usual routine, tending to the livestock and checking on his stored tobacco crop, but his mood was notably agitated. Ben later testified that the master had been drinking more than usual. Not enough to incapacitate him, but sufficient to make his temper even more unpredictable than normal. Coffee observed that he kept checking the road for signs that his daughters might return early from their New Year's visit to Jefferson City, though the heavy snow made travel virtually impossible. As evening approached, Newsom's attention increasingly focused on Celia, who was performing her regular household duties with what appeared to be unusual calm. What he didn't notice, but what Coffee would later remember with chilling clarity, was that Celia had spent the afternoon making subtle preparations throughout the house and barn. She had repositioned certain pieces of firewood near the main hearth, adjusted the placement of oil lamps in ways that seemed insignificant, and made several trips to the barn carrying items that she claimed were related to evening livestock care. At approximately 8 o'clock, Robert Newsom dismissed the other enslaved people to their quarters, a routine that had played out hundreds of times over the previous 5 years. Ben, Coffee, Patsy, and young Joe made their way to the slave cabin, where they huddled around their own small fire and tried to ignore what they knew was about to unfold in the main house. The thick log walls of their quarters and the howling wind outside typically muffled whatever sounds emerged from Newsom's bedroom, creating a conspiracy of silence that had enabled his crimes for half a decade. But this night would be different. According to testimony that Coffee would later provide, the sounds from the main house followed an unusual pattern. Instead of the muffled voices and rhythmic noises that typically characterize these encounters, there were periods of complete silence, broken by what sounded like furniture being moved, and at one point, what might have been the crash of breaking crockery. At approximately 10 o'clock, Coffee testified, she heard Robert Newsom's voice raised in what sounded like surprise rather than anger, a tone she had never heard from him during his nighttime sessions with Celia. This was followed by a period of silence that stretched for nearly an hour, long enough that Coffee began to wonder whether something had gone wrong. The absence of sound was more disturbing than the usual noises of abuse, suggesting that whatever was happening in the main house had departed from its horrible routine. What we know about the events inside the Newsom house during those crucial hours comes primarily from Celia's own testimony, delivered months later in a packed Callaway County courtroom. According to her account, Robert Newsom had summoned her to his bedroom as expected, but she had come prepared for something other than submission. I told him I couldn't bear it anymore, Celia testified, her voice steady despite the gravity of her words. I said the baby I was carrying might not survive if he kept forcing himself on me. I begged him to wait until after the birth to show some Christian mercy. Newsom's response, according to Celia, was to strike her across the face hard enough to knock her to the floor. But instead of the compliance he expected, he found himself facing something he had never encountered from her before, open resistance. I got back up, Celia continued in her testimony. I looked him in the eye and told him that if he touched me again, I would defend myself. I said I didn't care what the law allowed him to do. There had to be some limit to what one human being could endure from another. What happened next would become the central focus of one of the most controversial trials in Missouri history. According to Celia's account, Robert Newsom responded to her defiance with a violence that surpassed even his usual brutality. He grabbed her by the throat and began to choke her, telling her that she would submit or he would kill her, and claim that she had died from complications of pregnancy. But Celia had prepared for this possibility. During her months of planning, she had concealed a heavy iron poker near the bedroom fireplace, positioning it so that it would be within reach if the situation became desperate. As Newsom's hands tightened around her throat and her vision began to dim, she managed to grasp the poker and strike him across the temple with enough force to knock him unconscious. The sound of Robert Newsom's body hitting the floor was, Celia later testified, unlike anything she had ever heard. A combination of the impact itself and the sudden absence of the heavy breathing and muttered threats that had terrorized her for 5 years. For several minutes, she stood over his motionless form, waiting to see whether he would regain consciousness and resume his attack. When it became clear that Newsom was dead, his skull fractured from the force of the blow, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling, Celia found herself facing a new and equally terrifying reality. She had killed a white man in Missouri, a crime that would result in her immediate execution regardless of the circumstances that had led to it. Even if she could somehow prove that she had acted in self-defense, the legal system offered no protection for an enslaved person who killed their master. What happened next reveals the desperate intelligence that had enabled Celia to survive 5 years of systematic abuse. Rather than panicking or attempting to flee, both of which would have been futile in the middle of a Missouri winter, She began to methodically execute a plan that she had apparently been developing for weeks. The next phase of Celia's plan required a level of physical and emotional strength that seems almost superhuman given her condition. 6 months pregnant, injured from the struggle with Newsom, and working alone in sub-zero temperatures. Yet the evidence that emerged during her trial suggests that she executed each step with methodical precision, as if she had rehearsed these actions dozens of times in her mind. First, she needed to move Robert Newsom's body from his bedroom to a location where she could dispose of it completely. This task alone would have challenged a healthy man, much less a pregnant woman. But Celia had apparently anticipated this difficulty. Using bed sheets and rope that she had strategically positioned earlier in the evening, she managed to wrap Newsom's corpse and drag it down the stairs and out of the house toward the barn. The barn itself had been prepared for what was to come. During her afternoon trips, Celia had rearranged the stored hay and firewood to create what was essentially a funeral pyre, though she would never use that term in her later testimony. She had also gathered additional combustible materials: pine pitch, dried corn stalks, and even some of the fine fabric that Newsom had purchased for her dresses, anything that would burn hot and fast enough to consume evidence completely. Coffey's testimony provides the only witness account of the next few hours, though her view was limited to what she could observe from the slave quarters. She reported seeing unusual flickering lights in the barn sometime after midnight, far brighter and more active than the typical glow of a single lantern. More disturbing was the smell that began to drift across the farm around 2 in the morning. Not just wood smoke, but something organic and terrible that made her stomach turn. "It smelled like when we butchered hogs in the fall," Coffey testified, "but different somehow, sweeter and more sickening." The fire that Celia set in the barn burned with an intensity that was visible even through the thick frost on the slave quarters' windows. But this wasn't a random blaze. It was carefully controlled, designed to consume specific materials while leaving the barn structure intact enough to suggest an accidental fire. The engineering of this destruction shows a level of planning that suggests Celia had studied the science of combustion, possibly from the same books that had taught her about Missouri's legal statutes. By dawn on January 1st, 1855, the fire had burned itself out, leaving what appeared to be the aftermath of a tragic accident. The interior of the barn had been gutted, with charred timbers and ash covering what had once been stored feed and equipment. To a casual observer, it might have looked like a fire had started accidentally, perhaps from a carelessly placed lantern or a spark from someone's pipe, and spread quickly through the dry materials. But Celia's plan required more than just destroying the evidence. She also needed to create a plausible explanation for Robert Newsom's absence. When the other enslaved people emerged from their quarters on New Year's morning, they found her in the kitchen of the main house, preparing breakfast as if it were any other day. When Ben asked about their master's whereabouts, Celia calmly explained that he had gone to town early to conduct business, despite the holiday and the severe weather. This explanation might have held for a few hours, but it quickly became untenable as neighbors began to notice signs that something was wrong. The first to arrive was Thomas Schoutman, a neighboring farmer who had planned to discuss a land transaction with Newsom on New Year's Day. Finding no one in the main house except Celia, who insisted that her master was away on business, Schoutman became suspicious enough to examine the burned barn and question the other enslaved people. Ben's testimony later revealed the moment when Celia's carefully constructed story began to unravel. Under intense questioning from Schoutman, Ben admitted that he had not actually seen Robert Newsom leave the farm, and that the master's horse was still in its stall. More damaging still, Schoutman noticed that Newsom's heavy winter coat remained hanging on its hook in the main house. Hardly the attire someone would choose for a business trip in sub-zero weather. As more neighbors arrived throughout the day, drawn by news of the mysterious fire and their friend's unexplained absence, Celia found herself facing increasingly hostile interrogation. The white farmers of Callaway County were not easily fooled, and they began to piece together a timeline that made Celia's story impossible to maintain. The discovery that broke the case came when Schoutman and two other men decided to search the barn ruins more thoroughly. Hidden among the ash and debris, they found objects that no accidental fire should have produced. Fragments of human bone, teeth, and Robert Newsom's gold pocket watch, its face cracked but its inscription still readable. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Callaway County intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive. Faced with physical evidence of her master's death and unable to maintain her fiction any longer, Celia made a decision that would transform her from a cunning killer into something far more dangerous to the established order of Missouri society, a woman willing to tell the truth about what slavery actually meant for those who lived it. The moment of truth came at approximately 4 o'clock on the afternoon of January 2nd, 1855, as shadows grew long across the ash-covered floor of the Newsom barn. Thomas Schoutman held up the charred remains of Robert Newsom's pocket watch, its gold case blackened but still bearing the engraved inscription, R.N., Faithful Service to God and Country. The other men, farmers, businessmen, pillars of Callaway County society, stood in a silent circle around the evidence of murder and destruction. Celia, who had been brought to the barn under guard, showed none of the hysteria or collapse that the men expected from a woman caught in such circumstances. Instead, according to multiple witness accounts, she displayed what one observer described as an unsettling calm, as if she had prepared for this moment for years. When confronted directly with the evidence of her crime, Celia made a choice that stunned everyone present. Rather than denying her involvement or pleading for mercy, she looked each man in the eye and spoke words that would echo through Missouri's legal system for months to come. "Yes, I killed Robert Newsom," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "I killed him because he had been raping me for 5 years, since I was 14 years old. I killed him because he told me he would continue to rape me until the day I died, and that my children would suffer the same fate. I killed him because the law gave me no other choice." The silence that followed this confession was profound. Here was an enslaved woman, not only admitting to killing her master, but doing so in language that challenged the fundamental assumptions of Missouri society. By using the word rape to describe her master's actions, Celia was asserting that an enslaved person could withdraw consent, a legal concept that Missouri law specifically rejected. Thomas Schoutman, who would later testify at her trial, reported that his first instinct was to strike Celia for her insolence, but something in her demeanor stopped him. This wasn't the behavior of a woman begging for forgiveness or claiming temporary insanity. This was someone who had made a calculated decision and was prepared to face the consequences. "She looked at us like we were the criminals," Schoutman testified, "like she was the judge and we were the ones on trial." The detailed account that Celia provided of Robert Newsom's crimes was devastating in its specificity. She described not only the systematic sexual abuse that had produced 2 children, but also the psychological torture that Newsom had used to ensure her compliance. She spoke of threats against the other enslaved people, of punishment that would extend to anyone who tried to help her, of a system designed to make resistance impossible. What made her testimony even more disturbing was the clinical precision with which she described the murder itself. She explained how she had studied Newsom's routines for months, learning when he was most vulnerable and how to position herself for maximum advantage. She detailed the construction of the funeral pyre, the temperature required to completely consume human remains, and the careful arrangement of evidence to suggest an accidental fire. "I spent every night for 4 months planning how to kill him," she told the horrified men. "I studied his books to learn about law, about fire, about what it would take to make him disappear completely. I wanted him to burn the way he made me burn inside." More damaging still, She provided details about Newsome's behavior that only someone with intimate knowledge could have known. The location of scars on his body, his habits and mannerisms, conversations that had taken place behind closed doors. She described how he would force her to address him as master, even during the most intimate violations. How he would quote scripture while assaulting her, and how he had begun planning to abuse her infant daughter once the child was old enough. But the most shocking aspect of Celia's confession wasn't what she revealed about Robert Newsome's crimes. It was her articulation of the legal philosophy that had driven her to murder. During her months of secret study, she had somehow gained an understanding of legal principles that challenged Missouri's slave codes at their foundation. "If I am property," she told her captors, "then I cannot be held responsible for crimes against my owner because property cannot commit crimes. But if I can be held responsible for murder, then I must be a person with the right to defend myself. You cannot have it both ways." Ooh. This logic was so dangerous to the established order that several of the men present reportedly urged immediate lynching rather than allowing Celia to repeat these arguments in a courtroom. The idea that an enslaved person could use legal reasoning to challenge the system that enslaved them was more threatening than simple violence. It suggested that the entire structure of Missouri society might be built on contradictions that could not withstand scrutiny. The moment that truly broke the composure of her captors came when Celia began to describe the network of people who had helped her. She spoke of free blacks in Jefferson City who had smuggled her legal documents, of a sympathetic clerk in the courthouse who had allowed her access to law books, and most shockingly, of several prominent white citizens who had known about Newsome's crimes and chosen to remain silent. "Judge Marshall knew," she said, naming a respected local magistrate. "He saw the bruises on my arms when I accompanied my master to town. Reverend Hammond knew. He saw my children and couldn't help but notice who they resembled. Dr. Breckenridge knew when he treated my broken ribs last spring. They all knew. And they all decided that Robert Newsome's reputation mattered more than my suffering." The decision to pursue a legal trial rather than extrajudicial execution was ultimately made by Judge William Hall, who had been summoned to the scene as word of the crime spread throughout the county. Hall, a Virginia-born jurist with deep roots in Missouri's slaveholding community, recognized that Celia's case posed questions that the legal system would eventually have to confront. Better to address them in a controlled courtroom setting than to allow them to fester in the community's collective conscience. But even as preparations began for what would become one of the most controversial trials in Missouri history, another layer of the mystery began to unfold. During the search of the Newsome property, investigators discovered evidence that Celia's education and legal knowledge hadn't emerged from nowhere. Hidden in the slave quarters, they found books, newspapers, and legal documents that no enslaved person should have possessed. Materials that suggested a network of support that extended far beyond the isolated farm. More disturbing still was the discovery of detailed journals in Celia's handwriting, documenting not only her own abuse, but that of other enslaved women throughout Callaway County. The journals contained names, dates, and specific incidents that painted a picture of systematic sexual violence that extended far beyond the Newsome farm. Several prominent families were implicated, creating the possibility that Celia's case might expose a web of crimes that the community's leadership had worked for decades to conceal. The question of how an enslaved woman in rural Missouri had gained access to legal texts, learned to read complex arguments, and developed the intellectual framework for her resistance opened new avenues of investigation that would prove almost as controversial as the murder itself. Who had been helping Celia? How extensive was this network of support? And what other enslaved people in Missouri might be receiving similar education and inspiration? As Celia was transported to the Callaway County Jail to await trial, these questions hung over the community like smoke from the burned barn. The physical crime had been solved, but the intellectual and moral challenges it represented were just beginning to unfold. The trial of Celia began on October 9, 1855, in a Callaway County courthouse packed with spectators who had traveled from across Missouri to witness what newspapers described as the most significant legal proceeding in our state's history. The case had already generated intense controversy throughout the region, with abolitionist newspapers in the North hailing Celia as a symbol of resistance, while pro-slavery publications in the South denounced the proceedings as a dangerous precedent that threatened the entire institution. Judge William Hall, presiding over the case, faced legal questions that had never been directly addressed by Missouri courts. Could an enslaved person claim self-defense against their master? Did the state's laws protecting women from sexual assault apply to enslaved women? And perhaps most fundamentally, could property be held criminally responsible for crimes against its owner? Celia's defense team, led by John Jameson, a respected attorney who had taken the case pro bono despite significant social pressure, built their arguments around Missouri's existing statutes protecting women from sexual assault. They argued that these laws made no explicit racial distinctions and therefore should apply to all women within the state's borders. If Celia had the legal right to resist rape, then her killing of Robert Newsom constituted justifiable homicide. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Robert Prewitt, countered with the fundamental principle of Missouri's slave code. Enslaved people were property, not persons under the law. As property, Celia could not withdraw consent from her master's actions, making the concept of rape legally impossible. Furthermore, they argued, allowing enslaved people to claim self-defense against their masters would effectively end the institution of slavery by making masters vulnerable to violence whenever their authority was challenged. The testimony that emerged during the trial painted a devastating picture of life under slavery that many white Missourians had never directly confronted. Coffey, Ben, and other witnesses provided detailed accounts of the systematic abuse that Celia had endured, describing a level of sexual violence that shocked even hardened observers. More importantly, they revealed the network of support that had enabled Celia's resistance, a loose alliance of enslaved people, free blacks, and sympathetic whites who had provided her with books, legal knowledge, and emotional support. This network proved to be more extensive than anyone had imagined. Testimony revealed that Celia had been in contact with members of the Underground Railroad, though she had never attempted to escape. Instead, she had used these connections to gain access to legal documents and to develop her understanding of Missouri law. Her decision to resist through violence rather than flight was, her attorneys argued, a direct result of her legal education. She understood that even if she reached free territory, her children would remain enslaved and vulnerable to the same abuse she had suffered. The most damaging testimony for the prosecution came from Dr. Marcus Breckenridge, the physician who had treated Celia's injuries over the years. Despite intense pressure to remain silent, Breckenridge admitted under oath that he had documented clear evidence of sexual assault and physical abuse during multiple examinations. His medical records, presented as evidence, included detailed descriptions of injuries consistent with rape and violent assault, some dating back to when Celia was only 15 years old. "I knew what I was seeing," Dr. Breckenridge testified, his voice barely audible in the packed courtroom. "But I also knew that speaking out would accomplish nothing except destroying my practice and endangering my family. The law provided no mechanism for protecting an enslaved woman from her master's abuse." Even more shocking was the testimony of Margaret Foster, a free black woman who had worked as a seamstress in Fulton and had maintained contact with Celia throughout her ordeal. Foster revealed that she had been documenting cases of sexual abuse against enslaved women for nearly a decade, creating a detailed record that implicated dozens of prominent families throughout central Missouri. "Celia wasn't unique," Foster testified. "She was just the first one brave enough to fight back. Every enslaved woman I knew lived with this terror. Every one of them knew that their bodies belonged to their masters in ways that went far beyond labor." Foster's testimony opened the door to revelations that sent shockwaves through Missouri society. The defense presented evidence that Robert Newsom had been part of an informal network of slaveholders who regularly shared and exchanged enslaved women for sexual purposes. Letters found in Newsom's personal effects described arrangements with neighboring farmers to borrow enslaved women for extended periods, often while their own wives were away visiting relatives. The prosecution's case began to unravel when they attempted to argue that Celia's actions were motivated by jealousy rather than self-defense. This line of reasoning backfired spectacularly when it became clear that it implicitly acknowledged a sexual relationship between Newsom and Celia, something that undermined their core argument that enslaved people could not be victims of sexual crimes. As the trial progressed, it became increasingly clear that the case had transcended its original boundaries. Newspaper correspondents from as far away as New York and Charleston packed the courthouse, sending daily dispatches that turned Celia's story into a national sensation. Prominent abolitionists began organizing rallies demanding her freedom, while pro-slavery politicians denounced the proceedings as an attack on Southern institutions. The jury's deliberation lasted for 3 days, an unusually long time that reflected the complexity of the legal and moral questions they faced. When they finally returned to the courtroom on October 19, 1855, the tension was palpable. Every person in the packed courthouse understood that their verdict would have implications far beyond Celia's individual fate. The foreman, Thomas Westbrook, a farmer and Methodist lay preacher, stood to deliver the verdict with visible emotion. "We find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree," he announced, his voice breaking. "But we recommend mercy based on the extraordinary circumstances of this case." The guilty verdict was legally inevitable under Missouri law, but the jury's recommendation for mercy was unprecedented. In their written statement, submitted after the trial, the jurors acknowledged that they had been forced to convict Celia despite believing that her actions were morally justified. They called upon the governor to commute her sentence and urged the Missouri legislature to address the legal contradictions that had made their verdict necessary. Judge Hall, when pronouncing sentence, delivered what many historians consider one of the most remarkable judicial statements in American legal history. While bound by law to sentence Celia to death, he used his platform to condemn the system that had created the circumstances leading to Newsom's murder. This court has been compelled to apply laws that reduce human beings to property while simultaneously holding them accountable as persons when they resist their dehumanization, Hall stated. "This contradiction lies at the heart of our legal system and will, I predict, ultimately destroy the institution of slavery itself. Celia killed her master, and under our laws, she must die for that crime. But history will judge that the greater crime was the system that gave her no other choice." Celia's execution was scheduled for December 21, 1855, but she never lived to face the gallows. On November 23, aided by unknown accomplices, she escaped from the Callaway County Jail. Despite extensive searches and a substantial reward offered for her recapture, she was never found. Rumors persisted for decades that she had been spirited north by Underground Railroad operatives, while others claimed she had died attempting to cross the Missouri River in winter conditions. The truth of Celia's fate remains one of the enduring mysteries of American history. What is certain is that her case fundamentally changed the legal landscape of Missouri and contributed to the growing national debate over slavery. The trial transcripts were widely distributed by abolitionist organizations, and Celia's story became a powerful symbol of resistance that inspired other enslaved people throughout the South. The long-term consequences of the case extended far beyond Celia herself. Several of the prominent families implicated in Foster's testimony faced social ostracism and economic boycotts that forced them to leave Callaway County. Dr. Breckenridge's medical practice collapsed after his testimony, though he later became an active abolitionist and helped establish medical schools that would train physicians to treat former enslaved people during Reconstruction. Perhaps most importantly, the legal arguments developed during Celia's defense would later influence the broader constitutional debates that led to the Civil War. The contradiction that Judge Hall identified between treating enslaved people as property while holding them criminally responsible as persons became a central theme in abolitionist literature and legal challenges to slavery throughout the 1850s. The Newsom farm itself was abandoned shortly after the trial, as no one was willing to purchase property associated with such notoriety. The burned barn was never rebuilt, and local residents reported that the site remained haunted by the memory of what had transpired there. By 1860, the entire property had returned to wilderness, with only the stone foundation of the main house marking the location where one woman's desperate resistance had challenged the foundations of American society. This mystery shows us that even within the most oppressive systems, human dignity finds ways to assert itself, often at terrible cost. Celia's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about American history while recognizing the extraordinary courage of those who resisted injustice when the law offered no protection. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Celia's actions were justified given the circumstances she faced? Leave your comment below and let me know your thoughts. If you found this tale compelling and want to explore more hidden stories from American history, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the complex realities of our past. These stories need to be told, and together we can ensure they're never forgotten. I'll see you in the next video, where we'll uncover another chapter of history that they tried to bury.